It's late in London in the autumn of 2011. In a small apartment above Shepherd's Bush, two BBC journalists are still awake. Marion Jones and Liz McKean sit surrounded by papers, tapes and interview transcripts, fragments of a story that no one wants to believe. They're investigating a man once considered untouchable, one of Britain's most famous entertainers and one of the BBC's own. Each file they open makes the picture clearer. Complaints dismissed, police cases dropped, warnings ignored. If what they've uncovered is true, it could destroy more than just one man's reputation. It could destroy the reputation of the very institution that they work for.
The police currently have 8 formal allegations against Sir Jimmy Savile, 2 of rape and 6 of indecent assault.
We were perfect victims, because in a place like Broadmoor, people say, well, you're mad.
It is feared that Jimmy Savile's abuse of hospital patients was more widespread than first thought.
I was lucky insofar as I got away with it, and people were sorry for me anyway.
I'm feared in every girls' school in this country.
Isn't he a paedophile line, basically?
Yeah. All right. How do they know whether I am or not? How does anybody know whether I am?
I'm a very tricky fella. If you're tricky, you don't slip up. You never slip up if you're tricky.
This is the story of Jimmy Savile. Jimmy Savile. If I said that name to you, I would presume that you would have one of 3 reactions. One of disgust, one of humour, or you would have no idea who he was. And that all really depends on where and when you were born. If you were born in the UK before the year 2000, you likely know who Jimmy Savile is, the story of his upcoming, his presence on TV and his eventual downfall. Anything past the year 2000 and you likely know him like I do. Just some pedo who was famous at one time. And if you were born after the year 2010 or outside the UK, your chances of knowing the guy are slim to none. But why is that? Let's dive in. Jimmy Savile was born in Leeds in 1926, the youngest of 7 children in a working class Catholic family. He would leave school in his early teens to work in factories and coal mines, as many children did at the time. As he came into his late teens, he would find his way into the world of music promotion, where he would begin to organise dances in halls across northern England. Interestingly, Savile claimed to be the first ever disc jockey to use 2 turntables simultaneously to allow continuous music playback. Whether that was true or not is completely debated, but it didn't matter. It would position Savile in the space as an innovator and would help him launch a career built equally on personality as talent. So much so that in the 1950s he would be offered a spot on the BBC as a radio presenter, and this is where the Jimmy Savile brand would form. Jimmy Savile would quickly become one of the most well-known radio hosts in the country. Everything from his northern English accent to his appearance made him stand out. His peroxide hair, cigar in mouth and outlandish tracksuit made him instantly recognisable, and when television arrived, Savile would become a fixture. He would be offered a spot hosting the first ever episode of Top of the Pops in 1964, a TV show that would bring music to the masses for the first time. All of a sudden, you didn't have to go out and buy brand new records to discover new music. You could just switch on the TV and tune in to discover all of the latest bands. Top of the Pops would introduce bands like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones to British households for the very first time, and along with Savile's strange and unpredictable personality, it would quickly become a fast-growing cultural phenomenon. Beyond television, Savile would cultivate a second image as a tireless charity man. He ran marathons, held charity appeals and raised over £40 million for hospitals and charities across his lifetime. He became closely associated with places like Stoke Mandeville Hospital, Leeds General Infirmary and Broadmoor Hospital, where he would spend a lot of time and money improving their facilities and assisting with day-to-day tasks throughout volunteering and campaigning efforts. Newspaper photographs often showed Savile visiting patients, cutting ribbons and assisting staff. He was seen to the public as a man of good. When he wasn't hosting the nation's favourite TV show, he was tireless in his endeavours to help out the less fortunate. So much so that in 1975, the BBC would allow Savile to create his own TV show, one that he would go on to name Jim'll Fix It. In this show, he would allow children throughout the country to write in their wishes, and Jimmy would make them come true. You wanted your pet duck to fly? Jim'll fix it. You want to become a gerbil? Jim will fix it. He was affectionately endless in what he could do, and the people loved it. So much so that it was reported that the show was receiving upwards of 20,000 letters a week. Every child across the nation begging their parents if they could please write to Jimmy. Across the UK, Savile was collectively dubbed as Uncle Jimmy, a family member to the entire nation, a man that was affectionately endless in what he could do and what he would do. He would go on to receive knighthoods from both the Queen and the Vatican, and counted politicians, police officers, and even members of the royal family amongst his acquaintances. To the public, he was an eccentric success story, a working class man that used his fame for good. To the institutions he helped, he was a symbol of loyalty and generosity. Few questioned how one man had built so many connections, and few would consider what those connections would allow him to do. For decades, the public celebrated Jimmy Savile as a national treasure, a title that they were blissfully unaware was about to come crashing down.
When I was a teenager, my aunt ran something that was called an approved school, which catered for highly intelligent girl criminals. And as a kid, as a teenager, I used to go there. And she used to organise fundraisers where she would invite celebrities along, and you'd see ex-film stars, minor royals, all sorts of people like that there. So it wasn't that surprising to see Jimmy Savile there.
In the winter of London in 2011, two of the BBC's best investigative journalists are trying to wrap their head around a tip-off that they received from a colleague many years prior. Marion Jones, a senior producer for Newsnight, had built a career uncovering uncomfortable truths. He was steady, methodical, and known for pursuing stories others thought too complicated. Liz McKean, one of the programme's most respected reporter, worked alongside him. She had a reputation for empathy and determination, the kind of journalist who earned the trust of people who felt they had none left. Together, they formed a team of dedication and reliability, ready for anything. As they sit in their apartment above Shepherd's Bush, Marion starts to think back to where it all started, why they were here. When Marion was around 6 years old, his aunt would take head of an approved school in Surrey called Duncroft. It operated in the way of a boarding school mixed with a juvenile detention centre. Its purpose was to rehabilitate highly intelligent criminal children who had committed serious offences. Marion and his parents would go to the school around once a month to visit his aunt, and it was here that he would have his first interactions with Savile. Marion's aunt would put on charity nights at the school where she would invite celebrities and minor royals to fundraise events for the school. Marion and his parents didn't think much of Savile's presence at the time. He was known for his fundraising throughout the UK, and he felt very much in place attending these charity nights. That was until they would see Savile more and more at Duncroft, often during non-charity nights, during their menial family visits. According to Marion, his parents did raise concerns with his aunt about the presence of Savile at Duncroft, but his aunt insisted that there was nothing wrong and it was all above board. Marion wouldn't think much of it, and as time went on, he would go on with his life. He would go on to study physics at the University of Cardiff before becoming an investigative journalist with the BBC. It was here that Marion would start to hear the first whispers. Friends in the industry would make comments about Savile. It started off small, usually just, "I heard he was a creep." But the more and more he heard, the more and more that Marion would ask around. And it seemed to Marion that everybody in the industry had an opinion. Everybody heard a story, everybody claimed to know he was a paedophile, but nobody was willing to do anything about it. Marion would look back at his days in Duncroft and thought,
God, was that what he was doing at Duncroft? Is that what was going on?
And as an investigative journalist, he got to work. Marion's investigation into Savile would start in 1990, but as with any journalist at the time, Marion would come up empty-handed. No evidence, no witnesses. Savile was smart, and if there was anything going on, Savile would be sure to leave no evidence behind. As time went on, Marion would get caught up in his job and in life, but he would always leave time for Savile. It was his passion project, and if anything was happening, Marion would be sure to find it. So every few years Marion would return to the story, and every few years Marion would come up empty-handed, and it would remain that way until 2011, where Marion would stumble upon his first real bit of evidence. All thanks to our little friend, the internet.
If you own a computer, here's how to get the most out of it without buying lots of expensive software.
Every day, America Online is making it easier for people to live, work, and play.
Are you lost on the information superhighway? Let Florida Internet get you on the internet.
Now that I've gotten on the internet, I'd rather be on my computer than doing just about anything.
In the 2010s, the internet had become more widespread than ever before. Before the year 2000, if you wanted access to the internet, you would need access to an expensive and super slow dial-up connection. But throughout the 2000s, the UK would slowly gain access to faster and less expensive broadband options. This would make the internet more accessible than ever, and along with the rise of social media platforms like Facebook, the internet would become more powerful than ever. On the now shut down website Friends Reunited, Marion would come across a form for the former residents of Duncroft, and he would start reading. He would start to find people talking about a JS, how JS used to visit. They seemed to be disgusted that JS was still around and famous, and there would be many remarks about JS being a creep or a paedophile. It wasn't hard for Marion to connect the dots and find out that JS meant Jimmy Savile, but there was nothing concrete enough to take on as evidence. That was until he read an account from a former resident called Karen Ward.
I read an account by a woman called Karen Ward, who had been at Duncroft at the time, and her story would have sounded fantastical to anyone else reading it, like film stars and minor royals and this stately home that was also a prison. But it also had that JS came to visit, and what happened when he came to visit, and how he took the girls out and assaulted them, and took them to the BBC, and they were assaulted there. I knew who JS was. There was a mention of Gigi, who he went to see at the television centre. That was obviously Gary Glitter. I knew that 95% of what she was saying was true. I only had to believe that little extra bit, and it wasn't difficult to believe.
So, what was going on inside the prison walls of Duncroft? Savile seemed to take a special interest in Duncroft from very early on. It started small. Savile would start attending Duncroft for charity nights, but as time went on, he would ask if he could attend more and more to help out with the girls. When Savile would come on non-charity nights, he would often come bearing gifts and treats for staff and the residents, and he would work slow, chipping away at the tablet and slowly ingraining himself into Duncroft over time, slowly becoming part of the furniture. And it was then that Savile was his most dangerous. He would start to have unsupervised access to the girls and would be allowed to take them out on trips. He would start to organise trips with the girls to the BBC television centre, and at the time, that was a big deal for anyone. Going to the BBC television centre is like going to VidCon or TwitchCon nowadays, a place full of all of your favourite celebrities. Meanwhile, you're getting to see your favourite shows be produced and potentially even being on TV. It was every young person's biggest dream, but as Marion would come to find out, nothing is free when it comes to Jimmy Savile.
He wanted me to do things for him, he wanted me to fondle him. He asked me for Floror, and I didn't want to. And he promised me that if I gave him Floror, that he would arrange for me and my friends to go to Television Centre and be on his television show. Well, I was 14. Of course I wanted to go to Television Centre. I didn't want to give him wrong because I thought it was disgusting, but I did it.
Karen Ward would have had to live with that story in her own head for almost 30 years. Nobody to tell, because nobody would believe her. Karen, along with the other residents of Duncroft, were part of a group that Savile would be known for preying on. The type of people that were so vulnerable and compromised that nobody would believe them if they ever came forward, if they even had the ability to come forward in the first place. Karen was a criminal child, someone who had committed major crimes, so if she would come forward, who were they likely to believe? They would believe the celebrity, charity extraordinaire TV star every time. There's no question about it. But that all changed the day that Marion and Liz decided to believe her. As Marion sat in that apartment above Shepherd's Bush, surrounded by notes, tapes, and decades of silence finally starting to speak, one question became impossible to ignore. Jimmy Savile only had a minor connection with Duncroft. What about the other places that he was involved in? Stoke Mandeville Hospital is the home of the National Spinal Injuries Unit, a specialised unit that deals with major spinal damage, usually for those partially or fully paralysed. The unit was internationally respected, one of the world's leading spinal injuries treatment facilities, but despite its reputation, in the 1950s, as with almost everything in the UK, it was chronically underfunded, which means that charities, fundraisers, donors mattered more than anything. And unfortunately, that's where the downfall begins. Because one public appeal later, in steps Jimmy Savile. Savile didn't arrive to Stoke Mandeville as a stranger, and that was his superpower. He was TV and charity man Jimmy Savile, and his status was able to completely carry him. When Savile learnt about Stoke Mandeville's struggles, he would very quickly get involved, starting a massive nationwide fundraising campaign. He pulled every asset that he had together, from celebrity appeal to TV appearances. He would shout from the skies to the public to donate to Stoke Mandeville Hospital. And it worked. He was able to raise over £20 million for the hospital, and from that point forward, for Jimmy Savile, the game had begun. As with everything with Savile, it started off slow. He was never quick with his actions, and would always make sure that he would ingrain himself in the furniture before he made a move. He wouldn't just become a visitor at Stoke Mandeville, he would be a constant, and he would make himself useful. Because of Savile, the hospital was now able to buy new equipment and make quality of life changes, as well as rebuild entire wards. And this is the part that's really hard to say, because Stoke Mandeville completely benefited from Jimmy Savile. Like, materially, they went from a struggling ward, hardly able to provide care for their overflowing system, to a thriving ward able to take patients from all over the world. The ward existed in the capacity that it did because of Jimmy Savile, and understanding that will help you understand exactly why he was treated like royalty. Over time, he was able to gain access to on-site accommodation, and was even able to get his own set of keys. He was allowed full unsupervised access to the hospital, day or night, whatever he liked, whenever he liked. The patients at Stoke Mandeville were among some of the most vulnerable in the country. Many were immobile, heavily medicated, entirely dependent on staff for care. They were isolated, physically powerless, and often traumatised from sudden life-changing injuries. Savile had unrestricted access to them. Many young women and children.
I was following the porter. He had a white coat on, and he knocked on the door. Again, nothing said. Knocked on the door, and the door opened. The door closed behind me, and Jimmy Savile was leaning on the wall. He pulled me, and he gently got hold of me, pulled me in, and immediately started to kiss me with his tongue. And at the same time, his left hand went onto my right thigh under my dress, and his right hand went onto my left breast above my clothes. And then he said, "You've got to go." And with that, he knocked on the door. Nothing was said, and somebody else came and took me out back to the ward. And it was a different person when I came out. I was trying to make some sense, and there were 3 nurses on the ward when I got there. And I said, they looked at me and I said, you never guess what's just happened. And I got as far as Jimmy, and they just laughed, and I never got a chance to say much more to that.
He just forcibly pushed me backwards onto the bed. Pushed my clothing up. Yep. I firmly believe that, I don't know if all of the staff knew what was going on, but some of them did.
He said, "Oh, sit down." So I sat on like the edge of the bed, and he then proceeded to just literally push me down and try and get his hands in my pants. And I pushed him away and said no, and with that he pulled his trousers down. He said, "Oh, it's very good living in the nurses' quarters, because basically they often want to come and get in my bed in the night and come and see me."
The accounts were striking, not just for what had happened, but for how similar they all were. Different patients in different decades, but the same behaviour and the same confidence. Same assumption of immunity. It was reported later that nurses often felt uncomfortable around Savile. Some tried to limit access when they were on shift, others warned colleagues quietly, but no formal action was taken. Complaints went nowhere, concerns were not documented. Savile was never restricted, the hospital never removed him, it adapted around him. And that pattern held for decades. Savile continued to move freely through the wards day and night. His presence was normalised over time and justified by gratitude. Investigators would later conclude that Stoke Mandeville was not an isolated failure, but a case study in what happens when money replaces oversight, when gratitude replaces safeguarding, and when individuals become too valuable to challenge. For Marion Jones, that realisation was devastating. Stoke Mandeville was not an anomaly. It was proof that Savile didn't hide, proof that he didn't need secrecy, proof that access was given freely and kept in place because it was convenient. And if that was true inside a hospital, then there was one institution left that could no longer be ignored. Broadmoor Hospital occupies a unique place in the British system. It's one of the country's highest security psychiatric hospitals, designed to detain and treat individuals considered both mentally unwell and dangerous. It's similar to Duncroft in a way. It's not quite a prison, but to be there you had to have done something very bad, and once you were in there, you weren't getting back out. Access was controlled, movement was restricted, safeguarding was not optional, it was the entire point of the institution, which makes Jimmy Savile's presence there so difficult to comprehend. Savile's relationship with Broadmoor began in the late 1960s. At the time, the hospital was struggling with its public image. It was seen as secretive, frightening, and impenetrable. Senior figures at Broadmoor wanted to humanise the institution, to present it as a place for care rather than punishment. Savile presented himself as the solution. Savile's reputation preceded him. He offered entertainment for staff and patients, organised visits from other celebrities, and positioned himself as someone who could improve morale and soften public perception, and his involvement was welcomed. Just like before, Savile started slow and worked his way up over the years. While initially he was restricted as a guest within the institution, Savile's access expanded. Eventually, he was not limited to supervised visits or controlled areas. He was given accommodation on site. He was given keys. He was allowed to move through ward areas within the secure perimeter. His presence became normalised, explained away as beneficial, eccentric, and harmless. Savile was not a major fundraiser for Broadmoor in financial terms. The money he raised was relatively small compared to other institutions, but his perceived value lay elsewhere. He was connected, he was confident, he appeared to have influence. Staff believed that he knew powerful people, and some believed that he could damage careers if crossed. And that belief mattered. Savile was not treated as a guest, he was treated as someone who belonged. He attended meetings, he involved himself in internal disputes, he positioned himself as a mediator, a fixer, someone who could get things done when official channels stalled. By the late 1980s, Savile's influence went beyond access. He became involved in management discussions during a period of internal conflict at Broadmoor. He advised on staffing issues, he spoke directly to government ministers. His presence blurred the lines between volunteer, celebrity, and authority. Inside a hospital built on control, Savile operated without it. Broadmoor housed some of the most vulnerable people in the country, patients detained under mental health powers, people with limited credibility, limited autonomy, and limited ability to challenge authority. Many were institutionalised, many were already viewed with suspicion by default. Savile had access to them. Years later, allegations would emerge describing sexual abuse within Broadmoor. Some involved patients, some involved staff, some involved minors.
He started just coming in and plonking himself down and watching Top of the Pops with us on Lancaster Ward 1. He was able to sit in front of the sofa on the floor and hide what he was doing, which he put his hand straight up my nightdress, and we weren't allowed to wear pants. So I was, unfortunately I could do nothing, I couldn't stop him, because Broadmoor staff would have punished me if I'd stood up and said what he was doing. They wouldn't have believed me, and they would have just punished me. It was like bowing and scraping to him as if he was some kind of god. He was a DJ. What was he doing completely free in a top security mental hospital. We were perfect victims, because in a place like Broadmoor, immediately people say, well, you're mad, you're bad, you're a nutter, therefore we don't believe anything you say. And that's exactly my experience.
Well, I reported it to the charge nurse. I said that Jimmy Savile had tried to touch me intimately, and she just said I was making up bizarre statements, that I was being bizarre, that it wouldn't be tolerated, that, that you're just making all these bizarre thoughts, you obviously need isolation. He came and had a look through the slit at me, and like rattled keys at me. And I thought, he can get anywhere. I'm not safe. I'm never going to get out. I'm never going to get out of this room.
The accounts varied in detail, but they shared the same foundation: Savile's unrestricted movement, his confidence, and the assumption that he was untouchable. Some staff recall Savile behaving inappropriately towards women, making comments, touching them without consent, lingering in places that he shouldn't have been. Others described a culture where reporting concerns was discouraged, where questioning Savile felt risky. Enforcement of boundaries depended on who was on duty. Some wards pushed back, others did not, and Savile adapted. He gravitated towards areas in the hospital where resistance was the weakest. He avoided wards where staff challenged him. He learnt the system quickly and exploited its inconsistencies. Investigations conducted years later would confirm allegations of sexual assault connected to Broadmoor. The numbers were smaller than other institutions, but the conclusion was the same. Abuse occurred, safeguarding failed, opportunities existed because access was allowed. Perhaps the most disturbing thing is how unnecessary Savile's presence had been. Unlike Stoke Mandeville, Broadmoor did not rely on him financially. The fundraising was minimal, his influence was optional, his access served no essential purpose, and yet it was granted. For Marion, Broadmoor changed the scale of the story. It was no longer about overlooked behaviour or outdated safeguarding. This was a high-security institution making deliberate decisions. Savile had not slipped through gaps. He had been invited inside. And if Jimmy Savile could operate with impunity inside Broadmoor, then the question was no longer where he had abused his power. It was how many institutions had allowed him to do it. For decades, rumours about Jimmy Savile had circulated without consequence. Complaints were dismissed, stories were unrecorded, victims stayed silent. But in the late 2000s, those rumours had finally crossed a line, and they reached the police. In 2007, Surrey police opened an investigation into Savile following information linked to Duncroft Approved School. This was not the result of a media expose or a coordinated group of victims coming forward. It began quietly, with a single line of inquiry. A former Duncroft resident was identified and interviewed. She confirmed the essence of the allegation, that Savile had placed her hand on his groin, but she made one thing clear. She did not want to pursue the matter. She did not want to go to court. She asked the police not to contact her again. For Surrey police, this became a familiar problem. The allegations existed, but the complainants did not want to proceed, and rather than triggering a wider examination of Savile's behaviour, the case narrowed, and it stalled. The police would later write to 21 former Duncroft residents in an attempt to identify further victims. A second allegation emerged, this time involving an incident at Stoke Mandeville Hospital in the early 1970s. The complaints described Savile asking a girl for a kiss as she boarded a bus, then forcing his tongue into her mouth. She agreed to make a statement, but again did not want to take any further action. She did not want to attend court. Each allegation was treated separately. Each reluctance became a stopping point. At no stage were victims told how many others had come forward. At no stage were they assured that they were not alone. Later reviews would explicitly criticise this approach, noting that the failure to present the broader pattern likely discouraged further cooperation. Despite the investigation beginning in 2007, Jimmy Savile was not interviewed by police until October 2009. Nearly 2 years had passed. When the interview finally took place, it was conducted under caution. but everything about it favoured Savile. The interview was held at Stoke Mandeville Hospital, a location that Savile knew well. It was arranged on his terms. He was not arrested, he was not searched, he was accompanied by a person of his choosing, and he declined all legal representation. Later reviews would describe the interview as Savile-led rather than police-led. Savile would enter the interview confident, dismissive, and openly contemptuous of the allegations. He described himself as an 83-year-old and stated that all of his life he had never done anything wrong.
This interview is being tape recorded. I am based at, which is with Surrey Police. I work with the Child Protection Team. What is your full name?
James Wilson Savile.
Okay, you said earlier it was okay to call you Jimmy?
Jimmy, that's my name, yes.
Okay, thank you. And Jimmy, can you confirm your date of birth?
31st of October 26.
Thank you.
That makes me 83 and proud that in 83 years I've never, ever done anything wrong.
He openly characterised the complainants as fantasists and opportunists seeking money and media attention.
I'm quite happy to answer a few questions, because if you've done nothing wrong, then you're okay. If someone alleges you've done something, but I've had so much of it in 50 years. I started in the 1950s, and it's always either someone looking for a few quid or a story in the paper.
When asked about Duncroft, Savile denied recognising names. He dismissed allegations as complete fantasy.
So, the reason for the interview, as I say, I work with the Child Protection Team. I have received reports from a lady called... So, she reported to me that when she was a resident of Duncroft Children's Home in Staines in the 1970s, she was told by another girl, when Jimmy Savile visited, he touched her all over the clothes.
Oh, out of the question.
And he would tell her he would buy her chocolates when she got to the age of 16.
Out of the question.
Both girls were under 16 when saw him behave inappropriately. Said he put her hands over his clothes and moved it around, making him... So, on making further inquiries, I became aware of 2 further incidents that were reported. She was also at Duncroft. She stated that she was asked to show the visitor Jimmy Savile around, and he asked her to comb his hair and then massage him.
Not true, none of it.
And then massage his, and then give him.
Oh, out of the question.
And she refused. And then finally, the last one. She stated she was in girls' choir. They attended a concert at Stoke Mandeville Hospital in Aylesbury, and Jimmy Savile was present. As she left the area, he kissed her on the lips and then put her tongue in his mouth.
Out of the question.
When challenged on why accusations kept resurfacing, he suggested they were seasonal, motivated by Christmas or newspaper payments. Perhaps the most revealing was how Savile spoke about Stoke Mandeville itself. During the interview, he referred to the hospital as something he owned, stating that while the NHS ran it, it belonged to him.
I'm not at clever clubs or anything like that. What I'd really like to do is go up to Dales, have a walk, go training, this, that or the other, but this business won't let you do that. My business, there's women looking for a few quids. We always get something like this come up for Christmas because we want a few quid for Christmas, right? And normally you can brush them off like midgets. It's not much of a price to pay for the lifestyle that we're getting, you know what I mean? I own this hospital. NHS run it, I own it. And that's not bad.
The interview concluded without arrest. No immediate follow-up took place. No additional institutions were alerted. Stoke Mandeville management were not informed that an interview concerning sexual allegations had taken place on their premises. Thames Valley Police were not notified, despite jurisdictional relevance. Subsequent reviews would heavily criticise these decisions. They would note failures to challenge Savile's claims, failures to escalate safeguarding concerns, and failures to recognise the significance of multiple allegations pointing towards a single individual. Ultimately, the investigation ended without charge. The reasoning was insufficient evidence, and Jimmy Savile walked away. For Marion Jones, the police file was devastating. Not because the allegations were weak, but because the system had treated them as isolated incidents rather than evidence of a pattern. Over the next few weeks, Marion and Liz would face the same challenges as the police, but they didn't have people ready to stand up in front of camera and tell their story. In fact, the only person that they had was Karen Ward. It would be a difficult battle, but it was one that they were ready to take on. Marion and Liz gathered all of their evidence into one folder, ready to hand over to the BBC. Savile had evaded institutions. He had evaded the police. but he would not evade them. They sat down on the apartment couch for the final time, for one last breath before the storm. They turned on the TV, and everything in front of them instantly shattered.
One of the country's best-known broadcasters, Sir Jimmy Savile, has died at the age of 84. With a career that spanned 40 years, he was famous for his show Jim'll Fix It and for being the first and last presenter of Top of the Pops. Sir Jimmy was also well known for his charity work, raising more than £40 million. Well, many tributes have been paid tonight, and Prince Charles said he was saddened by the news. Nick Hyam looks back at his life.
Jimmy Savile died on the 29th of October 2011 at the age of 84. The news was met with national mourning. Newspapers praised his charity work, television schedules filled up with tributes. The BBC aired retrospectives celebrating his career. Savile died, publicly remembered as a national treasure. But behind the scenes, the effect was immediate. For the first time in decades, Jimmy Savile no longer had power. He couldn't sue, he couldn't threaten, he couldn't influence. The fear that had followed him for most of his life evaporated overnight, and people noticed. In the weeks following Savile's death, Marion and Liz returned to their investigation. The evidence had not changed, the allegations had not changed, but the atmosphere had. Survivors who were previously hesitant began speaking more freely. Others who had withdrawn reconsidered. The same stories resurfaced, now without the weight of Savile's presence hanging over them. By late 2011, the BBC had enough material to proceed. Multiple on-the-record accounts, corroborating patterns, institutional failures spanning decades. This was no longer a fragile story, it was broadcast ready. And then all of a sudden, it wasn't.
It was obvious to us that we were going to expose him. We found more and more people who had been at Duncroft. We found out that similar things had gone on at the other hospitals that Savile was working at. By the time we were ready to go with this programme, we thought that maybe 100 girls, 10 different establishments had been assaulted. That was a huge underestimate, but we already knew it was a major problem. And then, about a week before broadcast, the BBC started to get cold feet. They suddenly said that Savile being a paedophile was not a story, that Savile being a paedophile at the BBC wasn't a story, that it would only be a story if there'd been a mix-up and a failure by the police. That would be a story, but nothing else would. And over the course of about a week, they killed the story. And myself and Liz McKean fought back, trying to get the story out there, got to see the Director General and talked to the Director General of the BBC and told him about it and said, what's happening? Why aren't you broadcasting the investigation? But the whole thing was covered up.
For Marion and Liz, the decision was devastating. Years of work, years of trust building with survivors set aside at the final stage. The story did not disappear, it simply sat in silence. But that silence didn't last long at all. In 2012, ITV picked up the investigation, free from the BBC's institutional conflict. They proceeded where the BBC had hesitated. The documentary aired under the title Exposure, the other side of Jimmy Savile. And the reaction was immediate. Phone lines were overwhelmed, police across the country were flooded with reports, survivors came forward in numbers no one had anticipated. What had once seemed like isolated allegations became a national reckoning, and public anger would very quickly turn towards the BBC. Questions mounted. Why had the investigation been pulled? Who made the decision? Who knew? And when? The BBC launched internal reviews. External inquiries followed. Senior figures resigned. Trust collapsed. The corporation that had once protected Savile now found itself at the centre of the story. Police reopened investigations. Operation U-Tree was launched. Hundreds of allegations were recorded. Dozens of institutions were named. Savile was confirmed as one of the most prolific sexual predators in British history. But none of this was new. The stories had existed for decades. The victims had always been there. What changed was belief. Jimmy Savile was never exposed by the institutions that enabled him. He was exposed because he died. It's late in London in the summer of 2012. The apartment above Shepherd's Bush is now quiet. Papers are gone. Tapes are boxed. The story that once lived in fragments had been told in full. Marion Jones and Liz McKean are no longer chasing a man who can outrun consequence. The work is finished, but the weight remains. Jimmy Savile is gone, but the damage is not. For decades, Savile operated openly, not because he was clever, but because he was trusted. Not because he hid, but because people looked away. Institutions did not fail by accident. They failed because protecting themselves felt easier than listening to those without power. The survivors did not misunderstand what had happened to them. They were not confused. They were not lying. They were simply ignored. The story is often told as an anomaly, a monster, a singular evil. But that framing misses the point. Savile did not act alone. He acted inside systems that rewarded silence, that valued reputation over safeguarding, that treated vulnerable people as collateral damage. The most uncomfortable truth is that nothing Savile did required secrecy. He relied on familiarity, on gratitude, on the assumption that some people are beyond suspicion. And when the truth finally emerged, it did not arrive through bravery or reform. It arrived because time ran out. Jimmy Savile died before he could be held accountable. Many victims never saw justice. Many institutions apologised long after apologies mattered. And what remains is a reminder that fame is not a glowing reference. Just because somebody is well known doesn't mean that they should be trusted. This story does not end with resolution. It doesn't have a happy ending. The victims of Jimmy Savile will forever live with the scars that he left, and the world will go on forgetting. And that is a pretty unsatisfying ending. But that was the story of Jimmy Savile.